The wind was dry. The ground cracked. President Traoré stood silently beside her as they stepped out of the convoy. Around them were the ruins of a village, burned huts, abandoned sandals, a rusted swing still swaying. Children peeked from behind broken walls. One held a biscuit wrapper like treasure. "This," Traoré said softly, "is what they don't put in reports." The Frenchwoman, once confident behind protocols, felt her breath catch. This wasn't a mission, it was a mirror, and it shook her. What she saw would begin a journey no agency could predict. Stay with us. What happens next will challenge loyalty, reveal truth, and ignite a transformation you'll never forget. She had read the files. She had memorized every line of the confidential directive stamped Level 3, Eyes Only. Her role was clear: observe, influence, report. Not interfere, not care. When her boots first touched the red clay of Burkina Faso, she wore the mask of a seasoned diplomat, composed, detached, discreet. But within hours, that mask would crack and eventually fall. It began with a surprise visit. President Traoré had insisted on taking her to the field before any official meetings. "Before you sit in a room and talk education," he said, "you need to see what the classroom looks like." The motorcade drove for hours across brittle land, scorched by drought and years of quiet war. The roads thinned into trails, the villages shrank from structures into silhouettes. At last, they arrived in a place that had no name on her map. There was no welcome ceremony, no flags, no choir, just silence. What met her was a torn chalkboard nailed to a termite-eaten stump. Children stood barefoot in rows, some with swollen bellies, some with old scars on young skin. One child clutched a water bottle with no cap. Another girl wore a plastic bag as shoes, tied with wire. But they weren't begging, they weren't broken. They were waiting to learn. Traoré didn't speak at first. He only gestured to a child sitting alone on a rock, scribbling equations into the dust with a stick. The girl looked up. Her eyes met the diplomat's, and the woman flinched. Those eyes weren't pleading. They were daring her to understand. "This," Traoré finally said, "is what your institutions have failed, but these children haven't." That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat outside her quarters replaying what she saw. The heat was thick. In the distance, she heard singing, faint, rhythmic, unbroken. She followed it silently. In a clearing lit by a single oil lamp, President Traoré sat cross-legged on the ground with 6 children around him. He used stones, sticks, and the dirt to teach them subtraction. 7 stones. Take away 3. A girl counted slowly, then smiled. 4. They clapped softly. And then, without thinking, the diplomat began to cry. Not from pity, but from shame. She realized she had flown across continents to monitor something she'd never tried to understand. The next morning, her orders felt like a foreign language. She opened her notebook to begin her report, but her hand hovered over the page. Instead of writing about security, she wrote a single line: "What they lack in money, they carry in courage." Traoré noticed her silence during breakfast. "You've seen enough?" he asked. She looked up. "Not yet. I'd like to visit again without the convoy." For the first time, he smiled. What began as a mission was now becoming something else, something no report could summarize. She was no longer watching, she was witnessing, and deep down, something had shifted. She hadn't come to change, but she was already being changed. Out her earlier code. Previous entry: Low Resource Education Settlement. Recommend further assessment. New entry: A pencil is not a weapon, but it can change everything. The next morning, she was invited to witness a village lesson led by a young teacher named Salif. He was barely 20 and had never graduated from any official institute, but his students sat in perfect rows, reciting poems and solving fractions with pebbles. His chalk was a piece of limestone stolen from a nearby quarry. His blackboard was a flattened tin sheet from an abandoned warehouse. His dignity, though, was unshakable. After class, he approached her and said quietly, "They learn because they believe in tomorrow, even if we don't have one yet." She nodded and wrote, "Belief doesn't require buildings, just breath." She had been trained to evaluate threats, but she was now evaluating something far more dangerous: hope. And hope didn't obey orders. That evening, she received an encrypted message from Paris confirming the presence of state-controlled propaganda. Request update on civilian trust metrics. She stared at it for a long time, then closed the message and turned back to her notebook. A page read, "They do not trust governments, but they trust a teacher with no salary. That trust is stronger than any regime." The next day, she left the notebook in her bag and began walking with the children instead. She helped carry water, shared her fruit, and sat beside them during lessons. She no longer needed to document them to justify her presence. Being there was the only justification that mattered. Still, every night she wrote, but now her notebook was not for her agency, it was for herself, a record of what couldn't be unseen. A testimony of moments too honest for diplomacy. She didn't know it yet, but this shift in her pen would soon put her in direct conflict with the very people who sent her. And it all began because a barefoot child had once said, "I want to learn numbers so I can count how many days I stay alive." And she had no defense for that truth. She expected a formal dinner, crystal glasses, guards nearby, silverware perfectly aligned. Instead, when the invitation arrived, it was handwritten on recycled paper and delivered by a barefoot boy. It read, "Come share a meal beneath the neem tree. No guards, no gowns, just truth." When she arrived, she saw Traoré already seated on a low wooden stool, dressed in a simple cotton tunic, sleeves rolled to his elbows. A worn mat lay on the ground beside him. Nearby, a small fire crackled under a dented cooking pot, sending up the scent of millet and okra. She hesitated, then sat. There were no journalists, no ministers, no interpreters, just two people, the night and a bowl of food meant to be shared. Traoré handed her a cup of water. "Straight from the village well," he said. "No filters. That's how we all drink here. If it's good enough for them, it's good enough for me." She took it and drank. He studied her quietly, then spoke. "France has sent us many advisors over the years, economic consultants, education analysts, policy strategists. They all come in suits, take notes, make recommendations, and fly home. But not one stayed to build a school. Why is that?" She wasn't ready. She opened her mouth, closed it again. She had been trained for security, trade, counterterrorism, but not this. This was not strategy. This was soul. "I don't know," she finally whispered. He didn't smirk, didn't gloat. He just nodded. "There's a difference," he said, "between helping and handing over. Aid is a gift you control. Ownership is what happens when we do it ourselves, even if we do it barefoot." She lowered her gaze. The red notebook sat in her lap, closed tonight. This was not a night for reporting. This was a night for listening. Traoré broke off a piece of bread and handed it to her. He said, "You know, when I was a boy, I studied by candlelight. We didn't have chairs, so we used stones. No books, so we copied each other's notes on banana leaves. But we learned, because our parents taught us that the mind is the one thing no colonizer could ever chain." She looked at him then, not as a target or political figure, but as a man carved by struggle, a leader who still smelled of smoke and clay, not leather seats and power. "What do you want from us?" she asked, barely above a whisper. He chuckled softly. "Nothing, that's the point. I want us to stop needing you, not out of pride, out of survival." They ate in silence for a while. The stars blinked overhead, bold and unashamed. Finally she said, "I came here to watch. I'm beginning to think that was the wrong assignment." He raised an eyebrow. "Watching is passive," she explained, "but this place asks you to feel, to act, to change." He leaned forward. "You want to change something? Then start with a single child. Sponsor their books. Teach them something you know. Don't wait for a government to approve it. Just do it." The words hit her like a gust of wind. Direct, unpolished, true. She glanced down at her red notebook. She had written about foreign influence, education deficits, infrastructure needs. But none of those entries felt alive anymore. Not like this moment. Traoré stood, brushing the dust off his trousers. He said, "I have to visit a village at dawn. You're welcome to come, but we'll walk. No cars." She smiled. "I'd like that." As he disappeared into the darkness, she remained seated beneath the neem tree, listening to the fire crackle. For the first time in her diplomatic career, she didn't feel like she was serving a mission. She felt like she was answering a call. The sun hadn't risen yet when they set out. No guards, no press, no flags. Just Traoré, a driver with an old truck, and the French woman in the back seat, gripping her bag. As they drove deeper into the country, paved roads turned to gravel, then to sand. Villages thinned into scattered huts. Even the GPS on her phone gave up. "We're off the map," she muttered. Traoré nodded. "Exactly where the truth lives." Hours passed before they stopped at a clearing surrounded by dry trees and cracked earth. A few goats wandered nearby. Smoke rose from a small cooking fire. It didn't look like a school. It didn't even look like a village. Then she saw them, children, barefoot and alert, sitting on 3 wooden benches beneath a sagging awning made of tarp and scrap metal. A woman with graying hair stood in front of them with a stick in hand, pointing at words written on a repurposed cereal box nailed to a plank of wood. The children sang the alphabet in unison, their voices rising into the dry morning air. She stepped out of the truck and walked forward, stunned by the silence that fell when they saw her. Some of the younger kids stared wide-eyed, unsure whether she was real. One girl tugged at her older sister's sleeve and whispered, "Is she a visitor or a judge?" The teacher stepped forward. "Welcome," she said in French with a soft local accent. "We don't have a name for our village, but we call this place Hope." Traoré smiled. "That's why we're here." They sat on small stools carved from tree trunks. The children resumed their lesson. No chalkboards, no electricity, just cardboard sheets, sticks, and memorized songs. The woman explained that some of the children walked as far as 7 kilometers every day. No government had ever recognized their village. No aid ever reached them. Yet every morning they gathered. Rain or heat, they gathered. The Frenchwoman scanned the surroundings. There were no buildings, just a few mud huts, a broken water pump, and a half-dug pit that looked like someone once tried to build a latrine but gave up. And yet, order, discipline, learning. It wasn't what they had, it was who they were. After the lesson, Traoré asked the children to share what they wanted to become. A boy in a torn green shirt stood and said, "I want to be a teacher like Mama Salma." A girl with bare feet and a braided ponytail added, "I want to teach children who don't have paper." Another said, "I want to be the one who fixes the benches so our school is strong." None said president, none said ambassador. They didn't dream of power, they dreamed of giving back. The French woman turned to Traoré, stunned. "They all want to be teachers." He looked at her, his voice calm but firm. "This is where revolution begins. Not with weapons, not with elections, but with a child who wants to teach another." She opened her notebook again, But this time she didn't write in code. She wrote exactly what she saw. No map marks this village, but I've never seen a place so clearly. As they prepared to leave, one of the boys ran to her and held out a folded piece of paper. It was a drawing of a stick figure under a tree holding a book surrounded by smaller stick children. She asked, "Who is this?" He replied, "It's you, tomorrow." Her throat tightened. On the way back, neither she nor Traoré spoke much. The truck bounced over rocks and past cattle bones and thorn bushes, but she wasn't watching the road. She was thinking about the children who had no map, no budget, no support, yet were rich in vision. Back at the capital, she was supposed to attend a briefing at the embassy. Instead, she stayed in her room staring at the child's drawing. Her mission had changed, and she hadn't been ordered, she had been awakened. What she had seen in that village couldn't be written in any report, but it would live in every decision she made from that moment on. The call came just after sunset. She was sitting beneath the same neem tree where she'd once shared dinner with Traoré. The children had just finished their evening lessons and were chasing each other in circles, their laughter rising like music into the cooling air. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, sharp and rhythmic. She knew the pattern, a secure line. She answered. A man's voice, clipped and mechanical, filled her ear. "You've been there too long. Protocol requires debrief. Return and submit full report. Priority level 2. She said nothing at first. The wind rustled the leaves above her. A child ran past waving a twig like a wand. "Agent," the voice repeated, "acknowledge receipt." "I heard you," she said slowly. "We expect transmission within 48 hours. Refrain from unsupervised contact with local leadership until your return is confirmed. Do not deviate from original scope. Understood?" She swallowed hard. Her fingers tightened around the phone. "I need more time," she replied. A pause. Then the voice grew colder. "This is not a request." "I know," she said, "but it's still the truth." She ended the call before he could respond. For a moment she sat frozen. That voice, so familiar, so absolute, had once meant structure, purpose, clarity. Now it sounded like noise, like chains. She walked slowly back to the makeshift classroom. The teacher, Salif, was packing away the few lesson materials they had. He looked up. "You look like someone who just got orders." "I did," she said. "Paris wants me back." He studied her for a beat. "And what do you want?" The question caught her off guard. No one in her career had ever asked her that, not without some condition attached. She didn't answer. Later that night, she opened her red notebook and flipped through the pages. What had once been filled with coded observations now read like confessions. Notes about children with no shoes but perfect attendance, about teachers who taught for free and cooked meals with their bare hands, about students who shared the same pencil because it was the only one they had. How could she explain that her mission had changed, that it had unraveled, rewired, rewritten itself somewhere between the dirt floors and the sounds of children learning under trees? She tried drafting the report. She stared at the blank screen on her laptop and typed the first line. "The subject has established contact with local leadership and infiltrated core education zones." She paused. That word infiltrated looked wrong now, filthy even. She deleted the sentence. She began again. "They have no resources, no electricity, no official curriculum, but they have hope. They have teachers who walk barefoot and still smile, and children who believe that learning is more important than eating. I was sent here to study their system. Instead, I found my own system breaking." She stopped again. That report would never be accepted. It would be flagged, redacted, rewritten by someone far away in an office with clean water and polished shoes. They didn't want truth, they wanted alignment, proof that their way was the only way. The next morning, she walked into the village classroom and sat on the ground with the children. Effet leaned over to share her writing slate. Amadou offered her half a mango. No one asked where she had been or if she was leaving. They had accepted her long before she realized it. That night, she sent a single message back to Paris through a secure channel. Delaying report submission. Local developments require further observation. Will advise. That was it. No apology. No justification. She switched off the secure phone and locked it in her case. She had once thought serving France meant serving logic, discipline, policy. But here, among barefoot teachers and sky-roofed schools, she had found something more precise, something deeper. She no longer served interest, she served humanity. And for the first time, she knew exactly who she was and who she refused to be again. The morning began like every other, dust rising with each step, the sun already pushing down hard by 8 a.m., and the children seated neatly beneath the patched-up awning, slates in hand. The air was dry, brittle even, not a single cloud in sight. The Frenchwoman had taken her usual place on a low stool next to Salif, the young teacher. Today's lesson was simple, spelling words using local proverbs. The kids loved it. They turned each phrase into a game. Then came the sound. At first, it was subtle, a low murmur in the distance. Then it grew louder, thick drops hammering the parched earth like applause. Salif froze mid-sentence. Heads turned. The kids went silent. Then chaos. The first drops struck the tarp roof and punched through a collective gasp. Within seconds, the sky opened completely. Rain came in sideways, sweeping across the open classroom in sheets. Pages flew, chalk dissolved. Water pooled beneath the benches. Children scrambled. Some ran to cover their books with their shirts. Others used their slates as shields. One girl tried to protect a sheet of paper with both hands, tears already mixing with the rain. The Frenchwoman didn't hesitate. She leapt into the storm, grabbing a plastic crate filled with lesson materials and dragging it toward a tree. She threw off her shawl and held it above two small boys crouched over a notebook. It was useless, soaked within seconds, but she didn't care. Fauna screamed as her banana leaf assignment floated away in the mud. The woman darted after it, slipping, sliding, falling to her knees, but catching it just in time. The ink had run, the letters barely visible, but she held it to her chest like a sacred text. Around her, the children weren't crying anymore. They were laughing, screaming with joy as rain poured down their faces. They stomped in puddles and flung water at each other, drenched to the bone, but lit from within. She looked around, then up, and laughed. She hadn't laughed like that in years. Not since she was a little girl chasing storms through her grandfather's vineyard in the south of France. Not since before diplomacy became duty, and duty became distance. The rain blurred everything. The trees, the sounds, the past. In that blur, something inside her broke free. It wasn't just her cover as a Western observer. It was the weight she had carried for years. The silence, the pretending, the belief that caring was a weakness. She was soaked, her shoes ruined, her blouse stained with red mud, but she had never felt more alive. Salif eventually gathered the children under a nearby roof made of corrugated metal. He was laughing too. "Class is canceled," he said, arms wide. "Today we let the sky teach us." The woman sat beside him, dripping, her chest heaving from laughter and breathlessness. "You've changed," he said softly. She looked at him, eyes wide. "I know." That night the children invited her to join them in singing. No instruments, just voices and hands clapping. They sang a song about rain being a blessing, a song passed down by grandmothers and field workers about how the sky always returns what the earth cannot. She joined in. At one point, she caught Traoré watching from a distance, arms crossed, a knowing smile on his face. He didn't interrupt, didn't speak, just nodded and walked away. Later, alone in her tent, she opened the red notebook, still damp at the corners. She turned to a blank page and wrote, "Today I stopped observing and started feeling." The rain didn't cleanse the earth, It cleansed me. She didn't draft a report that night. She didn't send an update to Paris. Instead, she fell asleep with mud on her feet and a banana leaf assignment drying beside her pillow. And for the first time since she landed in Burkina Faso, she no longer wondered when she would leave. The envelope arrived without warning, white, sealed, stamped with the insignia of the French embassy in Ouagadougou. She found it tucked beneath the front flap of her tent just after dawn. No note, no name, just orders hidden in formality. She didn't need to open it to know what it said. The official summons to submit her first full report had been delayed twice. Headquarters would not wait any longer. She had defied protocol, ignored transmission deadlines, and gone silent on matters deemed critical to foreign assessment. She had a choice now. She sat beneath the neem tree, notebook in her lap, fingers trembling. Around her, the village was waking. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Chickens strutted past barefoot children, brushing their teeth with twigs. A young girl balanced a jug on her head, water sloshing as she walked. No one asked why the white woman looked afraid. It took her 3 days not to gather information. That part had already been written. Dozens of entries across her red notebook, filled with stories, names, and small revolutions. What took her time was deciding how to tell the truth, and to whom. She typed the title on a clean document, If France Had Listened. It was not a report. It was an essay, 10 pages long, hand-typed, no coded language, no acronyms, no executive summary, just testimony. She wrote about the barefoot boy who memorized geography by drawing maps in the dirt, about the teacher who had taught for 8 years without pay, about the little girl who dreamed of growing pencils in the soil because paper seemed too impossible. She wrote about the difference between charity and dignity, about the damage done when aid arrives without trust, about the quiet defiance of a people who had learned to teach themselves when no one else would. She didn't analyze. She admitted, I was trained to monitor, to calculate influence and resistance, but I never understood what it meant to witness until now. Burkina Faso has taught me that intelligence doesn't come from satellites. It comes from listening to a child explain subtraction using stones and realizing the world's smartest systems have failed to count what truly matters. She attached no summary, no budget recommendations, no policy prescriptions. She printed it, signed it, sealed it in a brown envelope, and walked it to the embassy gate herself. The guard blinked at her. No courier? No, she said. It's personal. Inside the embassy, the report moved fast, faster than she expected. Within 2 days, word had reached Paris. Within a week, the essay had reached the Conseil, the foreign ministry itself. Half of them were outraged. She had ignored protocol, violated neutrality, and failed to provide a strategic assessment of local risk factors. One internal memo called her document a dangerous romanticization of a deeply unstable region. But there was one email she hadn't expected. It came from an address she recognized, an older advisor, now half-retired, who'd once lectured her at École Nationale d'Administration, a man known for his stone-faced objectivity. He wrote only this, I read your report 3 times and I cried for them, for us, for what we missed. She stared at the message for a long time. Outside her tent, the children were singing again. Rainwater had refilled the school's clay jug. The chalkboard was still cracked, but someone had tied it tighter to the wall using wire and a shoelace. The lesson that day was about verbs, to build, to stay, to learn. She whispered the words under her breath as she watched them from the doorway. In her coat pocket, her embassy phone vibrated once more. Another order would come. She knew that. But for now, she closed the flap, stepped into the sun, and joined the lesson. The knock came just after breakfast. She was rinsing her hair with a tin mug of well water when a young boy appeared at the edge of the tent, eyes wide, sandals barely holding together. "The president says to come," he said. She didn't ask where. She knew. Traoré was waiting beneath the neem tree again, seated alone with a small cloth bundle in his lap. The air was cool, rare for that time of morning. She sat across from him, brushing dirt from her skirt. No one spoke for a while. The sounds of roosters and distant village chatter filled the silence. Then he handed her the bundle. She opened it slowly, unfolding layers of cloth until her fingers found what lay inside. A pair of gloves, faded, threadbare, stitched from different kinds of fabric. One finger patched with denim, the palm reinforced with leather. They were soft but sturdy, clearly handmade. She looked up. "Teeing gloves," Traoré said, "made by the women in the next village for the ones who stay." She turned them over in her hands, speechless. He leaned forward. "If you stay, you teach, not because we need foreigners, but because you've already become one of us, and the children know it." Her chest tightened. This wasn't an order. It was a challenge and an invitation. She nodded. That afternoon, Salif stepped aside and gave her the front of the class. He smiled as he handed her a piece of charcoal. "They'll test you," he warned. "They always test new voices." She put the gloves on slowly, feeling the thread stretch over her fingers. They weren't perfect, but neither was she, and that, she realized, was exactly the point. 32 children waited under the cracked awning. No desks, no books, no light bulbs. They had scraps of cardboard, chalk dust, and one rusted tin can filled with pencils shaven to nubs. But they also had eyes full of fire. She cleared her throat. "Good morning." A few mumbled back. Some just stared. "I've never taught before," she admitted. Silence. "But I've learned a lot from all of you." Still nothing. She walked slowly to the front and drew a big circle in the dirt with the heel of her shoe. "Let's start with the world." One hand went up. "Amadou, that's not how my teacher starts." "I'm not your teacher yet." Another girl giggled. "Fauna." The lesson began awkwardly. She asked questions no one answered. She tried to write on the rusted tin board, but the charcoal broke in her hand. Her French was too fast, her examples too European. But then she paused. She took off her scarf, tied it around her waist, and sat in the dirt among them. "Let's start again," she said. "But this time, you teach me." They lit up. Fauna showed her how to count using bottle caps. Amadou brought over his prized leaf notebook and pointed to his drawings of different crops. Another student recited a proverb she had never heard before, and she wrote it down carefully, syllable by syllable. By the end of the hour, the children were leaning forward, raising hands, debating answers. She wasn't just instructing them, she was part of the room. Imperfect, uncertain, but present, and her gloves covered in chalk and charcoal, smears frayed at the wrists, but still holding on. At the end of class, Salif clapped quietly from the edge. "Not bad for a beginner," he teased. She laughed, wiping her forehead. That evening, as the sun set over the low hills, she sat outside and opened her red notebook again. But she didn't write a report or a reflection. She began designing a lesson of her own. A way to teach verbs using local stories. A way to show math through cooking measurements. A way to connect reading to song lyrics that kids already loved. She wasn't pretending anymore. She wasn't on assignment. She was a teacher. And 32 students were waiting for her again tomorrow. Too late was still there, but something had shifted. When she stepped out of her tent, eyes followed her. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Mothers turned their backs. Salif didn't wave from the school hut. And when she arrived at the classroom, none of the children ran to greet her. She knew before anyone told her. The night before, a French diplomat, sent for a brief visit to observe cooperation, had joined her and Traoré for dinner. Polished, arrogant, younger than he looked. Over goat stew and thin rice, He had smiled too tightly and asked too many questions when he leaned in and whispered, "You've gone native, haven't you?" She didn't answer. He hadn't come to eat. He had come to report. Now, less than 12 hours later, her cover was gone. The word had spread fast that she wasn't just a volunteer, that she had once carried a diplomatic badge, that her name sat on classified briefings, that she had arrived with orders from Paris, not prayers. The students sat quietly on the benches, fidgeting but avoiding her eyes. She cleared her throat. "We'll begin with—" But no one moved. No one opened their books. No one raised their hand. Even Fauna, who usually clung to her arm like a shadow, now stared down at the dirt. She took off her gloves, folded them slowly, and placed them on the nearest bench. "I understand," she said. "You trusted me with your dreams, and I didn't trust you with the truth." Still nothing. She turned to leave. Then, footsteps. A small hand reached out and caught hers. Audu. His palm was dry and firm. He looked up at her with those fierce eyes that had first stopped her weeks ago. "We already knew," he said. Her breath caught. "We knew the day you showed up in boots too clean for this village. We knew by the way you looked at everything like it was part of a puzzle." She blinked, stunned. "But you stayed," he said simply. "That's what matters." Murmurs rose behind him. Another student nodded. Then Fauna stepped forward, placed the gloves back in her hands, and whispered, "Class isn't over yet." She couldn't speak. Salif stood near the doorway, arms crossed, watching. He didn't smile, but he gave her a single nod, enough to let her know she wasn't alone. The lesson began slowly. Hesitant voices, short answers, but the wall had cracked. By midday, the rhythm returned. The room filled with voices again, not quite as loud, but real. That evening, Traoré came to her tent. No guards, no clipboard. "You should know," he said. "The leak came from Paris, not the boy who visited yesterday. They wanted to scare you or discredit you." She shrugged, exhausted. They succeeded. He sat beside her on the dirt. "No," he said. "They failed. You didn't run." She looked at her gloves now hanging to dry beside her red notebook. "I almost did." He nodded. "That means you're human." Later that night, she opened her notebook and wrote, "Trust once broken doesn't disappear. It waits to be earned again, not by confession, but by consistency." She closed the book, curled up under her blanket, and listened to the wind push softly against the tent. Tomorrow, 32 students would sit again, and she would show up, not as a diplomat, not as a spy, not as a savior, but as someone who stayed. The sun hadn't fully risen when she unpacked the globe. It was old, dented, a gift from a retired aid worker in the capital. The paint had faded in spots, but the continents still held their shape. She placed it gently at the center of the classroom, where 32 curious eyes gathered like moths to a flame. Most of the children had never seen a globe before. Fauna leaned in, squinting. "Is that the whole world?" she asked. "Yes," the woman said, spinning it slowly. "It's where we all live." Amadou raised his hand. "Where is France?" She paused, fingers tracing the faded blue of Europe. "Here," she said softly, placing her finger on a tiny patch of land in the upper left quadrant. The room went quiet. Some of the children leaned in further, as if trying to understand how something so small had carried such weight over their lives. Then she asked, "And where is Burkina Faso?" Amadou didn't hesitate. "There," he shouted, pointing toward West Africa with the confidence of someone who had studied it 100 times in his mind. The other children joined in, voices overlapping with pride. She smiled and took a piece of chalk, drew a heart around their country on the tin sheet they used as a board. "This," she said, tapping the heart, "is home." That night, she sat by the dim light of her lantern, suitcase open at her feet. Her fingers hesitated as they hovered over the French flag stitched on the side. Official, pressed, clean. The patch she'd received when she first joined the diplomatic corps. A symbol of identity, of training, of duty. But now it felt like a label she hadn't earned. Not anymore. She pulled out her sewing kit, a needle, a few threads, most of them the wrong color. But that didn't stop her. Slowly, carefully, she began to stitch a new patch just below the French flag. A red, green, and yellow square. Uneven, unpolished, but alive. The Burkina flag. When she finished, she took a charcoal pencil and drew a thin black line through the French patch. Not to erase it, but to say, "I came with this, but I stayed with that." The next day, the children noticed it immediately. Fauna touched the patch gently. "You stitched us to your bag." She nodded, "Because I carry you with me now." In class, she introduced a geography lesson, not from books, but from memory. They built maps out of sand and stones. She showed them how to measure distance between villages using thread, and how to find direction using shadows. The globe stayed in the center of the room, a reminder that they were not forgotten dots, but part of a bigger story. Salif watched from the edge of the awning, arms crossed, impressed. Later, he said, "They've never seen themselves like that on a map." "Maybe," she replied, "because no one ever pointed before." That evening, a mother approached her with a gift, a small piece of dyed fabric wrapped in string. Inside was a hand-stitched pouch filled with dried baobab fruit. "For the one who showed our children the world," the woman said, pressing the pouch into her hand, telling her they belonged in it. That night, she opened her red notebook and wrote, "A flag is just cloth, a map just lines, but a heart? That's what tells you where you truly live." In the quiet that followed, she ran her fingers along the new patch on her suitcase. It didn't just represent a place, it represented choice. She hadn't been born in this country, but she had chosen it. And for the first time, she knew the children weren't the only ones learning how to belong. It took her 3 nights to write the letter, not because she didn't know what to say, but because she wasn't sure he would even read it. Her father hadn't written to her in years. Not since her mother's funeral. Not since the last cold argument over politics, ambition, and the weight of their family name. He had always believed in duty, tradition, the kind that wore polished shoes, carried polished titles, and never questioned the structures they served. He had been proud when she joined the diplomatic corps. "Our name belongs in embassies, not in fields," he once said. And yet now here she was, in a village so small it didn't exist on any map, seated on a stool carved from a tree, teaching math using bottle caps and sticks. She dipped her pen into the ink and wrote slowly, "Papa, I was sent here to serve power, but I found purpose." She didn't talk about the embassy or the mission or the betrayal that nearly ended her time here. She wrote instead about the children, about Fama's shy smile when she solved a division problem, about Amadou's fierce pride in teaching younger kids how to trace letters in the dirt, about how the sound of their laughter after a rainstorm had changed something inside her that training never touched. She wrote about the first time she stood in front of the class, gloves slipping off her fingers, heart pounding, and how they had taught her more in 20 minutes than she could teach them in a month. She confessed she no longer knew what her job meant, only that she finally felt useful. "I no longer measure my success by reports or metrics," she wrote. "I measure it by whether the children run toward the classroom or away from it." She ended the letter simply, "I don't know when I'm coming home, but if I do, I hope you'll see me differently. Not because I abandoned my path, but because I finally found one that felt real." She folded the pages with care and walked it to a traveling vendor who delivered messages to the capital. He agreed to pass it to a consulate officer with diplomatic clearance. It was risky, but it was the only way. Then she waited. 2 weeks passed. No sign, no message. She told herself she wasn't expecting one, until, one afternoon, while preparing a lesson on time and seasons, a motorbike sputtered into the village. The rider handed her a small envelope, cream-colored and weathered from the road. No seal, just her name in a familiar, rigid hand. She opened it with trembling fingers. It was short, barely a paragraph. "I never understood why you left. I feared you'd forget who you were, but I was wrong. You didn't forget, you remembered something I never taught you. Come home when your mission ends, but only if your heart still wants to." She sat down in the dirt and read it again and again. That night she shared a piece of mango with the children and asked them to describe their favorite memories from class. One boy said, "The day we learned Africa has 54 countries." A girl said, "When you told us we're not missing anything, we're just starting with less." Amadou added, "When you taught us to write our names bigger." She smiled, blinking back tears. Later she opened her red notebook and wrote, "Sometimes home doesn't call you back with guilt. It waits for you to return with truth. And sometimes it says, only if you still want to." She folded her father's letter carefully and placed it beside the gloves on her shelf. She hadn't decided whether she would ever return to Lyon, but for now, the only map that mattered was the one drawn in the dust outside her classroom, shaped by small hands and big dreams. It started as a headline buried deep in the Foreign Affairs column. "French diplomat fails to report from Burkina Faso." Then came the morning talk shows, politicians wagging fingers, analysts asking, "What message does this send to our international allies?" One senior official from the ministry called her conduct a flagrant violation of diplomatic responsibility. They accused her of abandoning her post, compromising intelligence operations, and embarrassing France on the global stage. She didn't watch any of it. The news reached her through a torn page from a French magazine delivered by a traveler passing through the village. It showed her face, blurry and sunburnt, caught mid-laugh beneath a tree with the caption, "Agent turned teacher." She read it once, then folded the paper and used it to help a child practice reading French syllables. Outside her tent, nothing changed. The children still showed up barefoot, still shared pencils, still argued over who got to recite the next proverb. Salif still taught with his calm voice and tireless energy. The village mothers still brought boiled maize in plastic tubs, and she still arrived early, gloves on, notebook tucked under her arm, ready to teach subtraction or spelling, or sometimes just how to sit still and imagine. Then one afternoon, Fauna tugged at her sleeve and whispered, "Come see." She followed the children to the front of the school hut. The tin chalkboard had been scrubbed clean, but something new had been added at the bottom. Carved, not drawn, her initials, small, uneven, but unmistakable. "Who did this?" she asked. Amadou stepped forward. "We all did," he said. She stared at the board, her breath caught in her throat. "You are our teacher now, even if your country says no." That night Salif handed her a cup of tea. "You're famous now," he joked. She chuckled. "Infamous. They don't know you, but we do. That's enough." Word of her story had reached other villages. A group of students from miles away walked 4 hours just to sit in on one of her lessons. One brought her a small wooden token carved with a bird. He said, "For the one who stayed when others flew." Back in France, a minor protest erupted outside the foreign ministry. 10 people, a few handmade signs. One read, "We train diplomats, not missionaries." Another said, "She left her duty, bring her home." She didn't respond. She didn't need to. Because in her corner of Burkina Faso, the real protest looked nothing like the one on French television. It looked like a girl with no shoes sitting proudly in front of a chalkboard carved with her teacher's initials. It looked like a boy reciting multiplication tables in the same voice he used to beg for food. It looked like a tin roof held together with string, echoing with voices that refused to be silenced. She opened her red notebook that night and wrote, "I didn't abandon my post, I just moved it from a briefing room to a bench, from a policy to a promise." As she closed the notebook, she heard a knock at her tent. Salish stood there with a smile. "The chalkboard," he said, "has a new name." She followed him into the dark, stars overhead. Someone had written in big letters, "Madame Marie's School." She stood there for a long time saying nothing, not because she didn't have words, but because she finally understood. Truth doesn't need defending when it's carved in the hearts of children. The day began with the smell of rain in the wind, though the skies stayed dry. The children had gathered earlier than usual, lined up in front of the classroom, clothes brushed clean, hair neatly done by proud mothers who stood just beyond the clearing. It wasn't a formal event, no announcements, no banners, no officials from the capital, but everyone knew what it was. The first class she had ever taught, 32 children. Each one changed, grown louder, bolder, was ready to move on. There were no gowns, no tassels, no printed diplomas to roll and tie, but she had promised them something even better. She stood at the front with Salif beside her, both of them holding a large basket filled with seedlings, small trees, each wrapped in moist cloth and tied with twine. Fana was the first to step forward. The girl who once didn't know how to hold a pencil now read aloud with perfect rhythm. She took her seedling with both hands and looked up. "Where should I plant it?" Marie smiled and pointed to the open ground beyond the last hut. "Anywhere your roots feel strong." One by one, the children followed. Amadou took his silently, holding it like a treasure. He walked farther than the others, found a spot beneath the hill, dug with his bare hands, and planted it deep. Others planted theirs in pairs, some near their homes. One beside the water pump. A boy placed his next to the goat pen because, as he said with a grin, even goats deserve shade. No music played, no speeches were read, only the sound of fingers brushing soil and small hands patting the earth into place. When the last seedling was planted, Marie stepped forward and gathered them all under the tree where they had once learned to count by stacking rocks. She looked at their faces, no longer uncertain, no longer small. She said, "Let this be the only ceremony you ever need. Roots in soil, knowledge in your hands, not gowns, not gold-trimmed paper. You are proof enough." One child raised his hand. "Will the trees remember us?" She knelt to his level. "If you come back and care for them, they will never forget." The parents clapped, soft, steady, proud. Some cried silently. One grandmother approached Marie and kissed her forehead. "My granddaughter says you taught her to write her name, but I think you did more. You made her believe it means something." Salah handed her a cup of tea as the sun lowered. "You didn't just teach them to read, you taught them to stay." She sipped quietly for a moment. "Or maybe they taught me." That evening the village glowed with cooking fires. Laughter danced in the air. There were no caterers, just shared bowls, no microphones, only stories passed from child to elder and back again. Marie sat with her notebook open on her lap, the red cover now weathered and soft. She wrote, "They graduated with no caps, but each one carries shade, fruit, and a future. This isn't the end of a class, it's the beginning of a forest." In the distance, Fana was already watering her seedling. Amadou stood nearby, teaching a younger boy how to count the leaves. Marie closed her notebook and smiled. This was not the kind of graduation Paris would acknowledge, but it was the kind the world needed to see. The message came at dawn, handwritten, sealed with a red ribbon. delivered by a barefoot boy who grinned and ran off before she could ask questions. It read, "Only today. Come to the clearing. No gloves needed." She stood holding it for a long time, her heart caught between dread and confusion. After everything, the leaked identity, the headlines from Paris, the village whispers that had turned into love, what ceremony could possibly be left? She dressed in the simplest wrap she owned, worn soft by months of dust and washing. She tucked her red notebook under her arm, out of habit, then paused. She left it behind. This wasn't a moment to record, this was one to live. The clearing was full when she arrived. Elders sitting on carved stools, mothers with infants wrapped tight to their backs, children lined in rows, all of them cleaned and brushed as if it were a festival. Fana waved from the front. Amadou stood tall, hands behind his back, grinning with pride. At the center stood Traoré, not in his usual cotton shirt, but in a robe she hadn't seen before, green with golden trim embroidered by hand, made for moments that mattered. She stepped forward slowly, unsure. No one had told her what this was. For a moment she wondered if it was a goodbye. Perhaps word had come from the embassy again. Perhaps her time was up. But when she reached him, Traoré raised a hand. The clearing fell silent. "You came here," he began, voice steady, eyes locked on hers as a diplomat. "You carried the weight of a nation not your own. You arrived with protocol, with plans, with papers." A few quiet chuckles stirred in the crowd. But then he continued, "You set down those papers, you picked up chalk, you picked up dirt, you picked up children, not with arms, but with hope." She lowered her eyes, throat tightening. "You stayed," he said. "You bled into this land without asking for applause. You were exposed, criticized, even called a traitor, but you never left. You taught in rain, in wind, in silence. You stood in front of children when no one else would." She closed her eyes, her hands trembled. "And so today," Traoré said, stepping closer, "we offer no medal, no title, no flag." He reached into a small cloth pouch and pulled out a single necklace. Beads carved from local wood, strung with woven grass. At the center hung a tiny book made of clay. He placed it around her neck. "Today, we don't call you diplomat. We don't call you teacher." He stepped back. "Today, we call you sister." The crowd erupted, clapping, cheers. Someone beat a drum with their palms. Children jumped up and down. One old man stood and began to sing. She couldn't speak. The tears came quietly at first, but then they spilled warm and heavy as she sank to her knees, not in shame, not in exhaustion, but in gratitude. Fana ran up and held her hand. Amadou pressed a leaf into her palm. Silaf stood in the background, wiping his eyes with the edge of his shirt. Traoré waited for the moment to settle. Then he bent toward her and whispered, "The seed has grown, and so have you." That evening, as the sun bled orange into the sky, Marie sat under the neem tree, the necklace resting against her chest. Around her, children played as usual. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. She pulled her red notebook from her tent and opened it to the last page. She wrote, "Forgiveness isn't always for mistakes. Sometimes it's the village telling you, yes, you belong. Not because you were perfect, but because you stayed long enough to be human." She closed the book and held it tight. Tomorrow would come, but today she was home. The rains had passed and the earth had softened where a termite-eaten shed once stood. The village gathered now to raise beams and stretch cloth roofs, not for shelter, but for possibility. They worked not with architects but with hands, small and large, wrinkled and young. One girl molded clay to line the walls. A grandfather carved symbols into a wooden beam. A boy climbed a tree to retrieve rope. They were building a school not from concrete or government grants, but from memory, promise, and love. At the center of it all stood Marie. Her hands were covered in dust, a smear of charcoal across her cheek. a hammer in one hand and a book tucked beneath the other arm. She hadn't asked for this. No committee had approved it, no official ribbon had been cut, but they kept coming. Parents, children from neighboring villages, even wandering elders who sat nearby just to listen. It began with her old students, then with others who had heard of the woman who used bottle caps to teach math and sang lessons under trees. She called it Educour, the school of the heart. There were no uniforms, no national flag at the entrance, just a hand-painted sign carved by Salif that read, "Come as you are, leave as who you're meant to be." In the first week, 43 children showed up. Some spoke French, others only their tribal languages. Some had never held a pencil, others carried notebooks full of copied pages, too afraid to write their own. Marie welcomed them all. She divided lessons by rhythm, not age. In the mornings they told stories. In the afternoons they built gardens. On Fridays every child was paired with a younger one, not just to help, but to teach. It became the only rule: learn something, then teach it to someone else. They called it heart work. One boy, who had never written his own name, began teaching colors to a 5-year-old using river stones. A girl who once whispered in fear now stood and led spelling songs before the whole class. One by one, the children became mirrors for each other, reflecting back possibility where there had once been only absence. Marie no longer wore gloves when teaching. Her hands were her voice now, drawing, lifting, mending. She taught not with authority, but with invitation. Salif, now a full-time teacher at her side, watched in awe. "This isn't a school," he said one day. "It's a movement." She smiled. "Maybe it's both." Educour had no gate, no walls, and soon no borders. Children from different regions began arriving with cousins and neighbors, sometimes walking miles barefoot just to sit for an hour in the shade of what they now called the Tree of Lessons. A child from Mali shared a proverb that turned into a class discussion. Another from Ghana taught a new way to multiply. They didn't speak of nations, they spoke of ideas. One morning, a child asked, "Is this a French school?" Marie paused. "It's not French." "Is it Burkina? She shook her head. "It's human." They understood. That night, she sat beneath the stars, notebook open, writing by lamplight. She wrote, "No country owns truth, no border holds wisdom. When children learn together, they erase the lines we drew to divide them." Months later, a traveler passing through asked if she was still with the French government. She laughed softly. "I used to serve a ministry," she said. "Now I serve curiosity." As the school grew, elders began offering land. Mothers brought baskets of grain for the students, and children who had once dropped out now returned with younger siblings in tow. One child planted a tree beside the chalkboard. He said, "This will be our library. We'll read under it." Marie wept quietly, heart full. She never sent another report to Paris. There was nothing left to prove, only something left to grow. The title came to her before the first word was written. She was sitting beneath the neem tree with a circle of students, reading aloud from homemade books, pages stitched together from old sugar sacks and newspaper scraps. F.A. raised her hand and said, "Madam, what was your job before this?" Marie looked at her for a long moment and answered truthfully, "I was sent here on assignment." F.A. tilted her head. "Then what are you now?" The question stayed with her for days. That night she wrote it on the first page of a blank notebook, "The assignment that reassigned my soul." It took her nearly a year to write the memoir. She wrote between lessons, between harvests, sometimes in the dark after the lantern oil ran out. The words came slowly, at first tangled with shame and memory. But soon her pen flowed with clarity. She wrote not just about what happened in Burkina Faso, but about what changed inside her, the moments that unmade her training and rebuilt her humanity. She wrote about the boy who walked 12 meters to sit under a torn awning, about the girl who believed pencils held magic, about the village with no name that taught her what maps could never show. She described the day her identity was exposed and the silence that followed. She told the truth, not the version her country wanted, but the one the children deserved. She didn't send the manuscript to a French publisher. She sent it to a small collective of Pan-African writers in Dakar. They read it, translated it, wept, and published it. Within weeks, the assignment that reassigned my soul was printed in 8 African languages and distributed to schools, libraries, and learning centers across the continent. The first edition carried a dedication in bold letters for the child who believes learning is freedom and for the teacher brave enough to learn from the child. The French government banned it within a month. They called it unauthorized intelligence disclosure, political defiance, and emotional propaganda. French bookstores were warned against carrying it. One politician even said, "She forgot who she represents." But Marie hadn't forgotten. She had remembered. When a journalist from a Kenyan paper asked why she refused all royalties, she replied simply, "The children gave me more than France ever could." She donated every franc to village libraries. Some were no more than benches under trees, but they had books now. Books about Africa written by Africans. Books in the language children heard in their homes. Books that didn't explain their world from the outside looking in. One morning, Amadou stood before the class holding a copy of her memoir, now dog-eared and stained from many hands. "You wrote this?" he asked. She nodded. He squinted at the cover. "You wrote about us?" "Yes," she said. "You're the reason I became me." Later, Salif found her sitting near the field, staring into the horizon. "You realize," he said, "you didn't just write a book, you rewrote your country's story from the outside in." She smiled faintly. "No, I just made room for a new one." Word spread. Villages from Mali, Niger, and Togo sent letters of thanks. In Ghana, a group of teachers used her book to launch a training program. In Uganda, a refugee school began translating her chapters into hand-painted wall murals so that children could read without needing paper. One letter arrived from a young woman in France who had once been her intern. "You taught me diplomacy was a uniform, but your book showed me that shedding it was the bravest act of all." Marie kept the letter folded inside her notebook. She no longer wore badges or carried official documents, but every week new children arrived at École du Cours with curiosity in their eyes and her book in their hands. She didn't need titles. She had chapters. She didn't need borders. She had stories. And with every word, every page, every child who picked up her book and whispered their own name aloud with pride, she knew the assignment had never ended. It had only just begun. The letter came in a plain envelope with only one mark on it, the seal of Burkina Faso, carefully pressed in red wax. It arrived not by courier, not through embassy channels, but in the hands of a young boy who walked 3 hours just to deliver it. When Marie opened the door, the boy didn't speak. He simply handed her the envelope, smiled shyly, and pointed to the signature on the back. Marie stood frozen, fingers tracing the edge of the wax. It had been years since she'd seen that seal, years since Traoré had last visited the school. She had assumed he was busy with bigger things. Nation building didn't pause for small classrooms. Yet here it was, proof that even a small classroom could echo across a nation. She opened it slowly, sitting beneath the same neem tree where everything had started. Inside was a single page handwritten. "The nation you once observed is now the nation you helped raise. You didn't just stay, you stood." Below the words was no official closing, no printed title, just one more line. "With gratitude from every child who once learned with their feet in the dirt and their eyes in the sky." Marie pressed the page to her chest. Her hands trembled, her breath caught. Then she saw the second paper in the envelope, folded carefully, edges worn, a child's drawing, crayon on paper. It showed her standing in front of a classroom. The students around her were smiling, each one with books in hand. Someone had drawn her hair too long and her nose too big, but she didn't care. In the corner, a heart surrounded the words, "Madame Marie, our route." She laughed through the tears. The handwriting was familiar. Faz. She was grown now, teaching in the next village over. Amadou had become a teacher too, walking with a slight limp from an old childhood injury, but still leading lessons under a mango tree. Sif had helped open 2 more branches of École du Cours in nearby towns. The classrooms were different, some had roofs, some didn't, but the rule remained the same: learn, then teach someone else. Marie stood and walked slowly to the wooden shelf where she kept her most important letters. She placed Traorés beside her father's. One had told her to come home only if her heart still wanted to. The other had reminded her that she had never truly left home at all. Later that evening, Salif joined her near the school's edge. "A letter from the palace?" he asked, nodding at the red seal, now drying on the windowsill. She handed it to him. He read in silence, then smiled. "You know what this means," he said. "That I should finally rest," she joked. "No," he laughed, "that you've become part of the story." She looked around. The children were finishing their afternoon cleaning. One boy was carefully stacking books, each one hand-copied from older lessons. A girl watered the garden by the school gate. Laughter echoed from the corner where they'd painted a mural of the tree they once studied under, each branch covered in the names of students who had passed through. She opened her red notebook one more time. It was nearly full now. On a clean page, she wrote, "I arrived with the silence of an outsider, but today I was named in the voice of a nation. They didn't just allow me to stay, they let me belong." She folded the drawing and placed it inside the notebook. The next morning, the students found her waiting early in the courtyard, the chalk already dusted on her hands. She greeted them, not as a guest, not even as their teacher, but as one of them. And when class began, her first words were simple: "We have a letter to write today together," because she knew the next chapter wasn't hers to write alone. She never booked a return flight. Years passed. Seasons shifted. Children grew into teachers. Mothers became grandmothers. New faces arrived at École du Cours, not because of flyers or campaigns, but because word had spread that there was a place where learning didn't begin with credentials, but with care. Marie stayed through all of it. She stopped counting the years, stopped worrying about whether the embassy would call. No one from France ever came looking for her again, and even if they had, she wouldn't have left. The village no longer called her Madame. They called her Mabali, sister of the soil. Her red notebook, once her shield, became her most treasured relic. She read from it each year on the anniversary of the school's founding. Students gathered under the neem tree to hear the early stories: the day of the rainstorm, the first lesson with bottle caps, the moment she received Traorés's letter. With each passing year, her hair grayed, her posture bent slightly, but her presence never faded. She taught with less motion and more stillness. She listened more, and when she could no longer hold chalk steadily, she trained the youngest students to teach the newest ones. One morning she didn't rise for class. Fa, now the school's lead teacher, entered the tent and found her seated peacefully, the chalk already dusted on her hands, a half-written line still visible. "There is no nation without its children. There is no future without someone to believe in it first." The village went quiet that day, not in mourning, but in reverence. They wrapped her gently in cloth, stitched by the mothers she had once taught to read. The men dug her resting place beneath the tree she helped plant. The children carried her final lessons in their arms, copies of stories she had written, now bound in soft leather with the school's emblem stamped in gold. There was no government ceremony, no embassy flag at half-mast. But hundreds came from villages near and far. Some walked for days, not to say goodbye, but to whisper, "Thank you." They buried her in the soil she had chosen, just steps from the classroom. On her stone they carved the words without debate. She arrived to report, she stayed to repair. In the years that followed, the school grew. École du Cours expanded to 8 regions. Each kept the original rule: learn, then teach someone else. Her name appeared in lesson plans not as a founder, but as a story, a reminder that transformation doesn't come from orders. It comes from presence. Her red notebook is now sealed in a glass case near the front of the main classroom, open to a page where she had once written, "I didn't lose my country, I found my people." Visitors from across the continent still stop to read that line, and often they leave something behind: chalk, a pencil, a page of their own. The students gather them all, store them in a woven basket beneath the glass, and call it the basket of beginning, because for them Marie's story was never about what she escaped, it was always about what she built quietly, humbly, but permanently. And in the wind that rushes through the trees behind the school, some say you can still hear her whisper to the children, "Write your name, speak it out loud, because someone somewhere will need to hear it and know they belong."